Okay, so I'm going to start with a prologue with what something Lenin said a few months after the October Revolution, and he's looking back, and he's saying, "Now, how did we know that we had the support of enough of the workers and soldiers, the Soviet constituency? How did we know we had enough sufficient support for to make a play for power?" And he said, well, the reason we know that we had the support was that the workers and soldiers and everybody rejected agreementism. And that was the equivalent to support. That's the de facto equivalent support, he said, to supporting Soviet power. So there it is that he made it agreementism the central issue of 1917 for as far as the Bolsheviks were concerned. What they wanted to do was to refute agreementism and persuade the Soviet constituency to reject it. And once they did that, their work was done. So now I agree. I'm going to put on my glasses so I can read my own notes here. I agree that this is in fact the basic issue, the issue that dividing the socialists between the basic issue that divided the socialists, that is the parties within the Soviet camp, the parties that were trying to get power within the Soviet system, the basic issue dividing them was in fact was agreementism. And that the basic political story of 1917 is the story of its rise and fall. It was the majority of the Soviets at the beginning of the year and was a minority at the end of the year. If it's so basic, then the question is, why haven't you heard of it? And why is it such a new concept? And why do I feel necessary to come up with with this new term? I mean, it's an old term, but it's a new translation, I guess. Okay. So there are two issues, I think, for this. One is translation issues, which we'll discuss right away, but the other issue, I think, is that people tend to think that there's another central issue, and I'm not going to mention what that other central issue is right now, but I'll get to that later on. You can try to guess. Okay, so what is the basic difference? What is agreementism all about? Why is it the basic issue? Because the Soviet constituency in 1917 had a basic question that they had to answer. How do we in the Soviet camp, the workers and the soldiers and the peasants and everybody else that was in voting in the Soviets, and how do we carry out the revolutionary program that we've outlined for ourselves? How do we carry it out? How do we make sure that it actually takes place, that the government, whatever it is, will do it? We'll take necessary steps. And one way is we do it by means of a political agreement. That's where the word agreement comes from, with elite society. And I'm going to use the word elite society to mean bourgeois or census society or various other terms, but I'll just say elite society here. That's one way. We work out a political agreement with these guys, and we'll do the program together. And the other way is, no, we have to reject that whole idea of getting an agreement, because we're basic conflict of interests, and therefore it's not like it's evil or immoral to have an agreement with these guys. It's just that it was unworkable. It won't work. It won't solve the problems, and it won't carry out the revolutionary program. So if you choose the second alternative, if you're anti-agreementist, the only alternative, it would seem, is either a complete just let the bourgeois and elite society do it without our input, or have an exclusive lost power government that's based entirely on the Soviets and rejects any real political participation. And that, of course, is the slogan: all power to the Soviets, vся власть Советам, exclusive, no bourgeois parties, no liberal parties, no nothing. Okay. So let's go to the translation issues as to why this issue has been so occulted, so hidden around. okay, so the Russian word that I'm translating here is Soglashatelstva, which is a mouthful. Soglashatelstva. So it's hard to pronounce, and that's one reason I'm not even trying to keep it in Russian. So that has two parts, that word, and one is a suffix, and that's a sort of istva, you know, that little, it's a suffix meaning ism, basically, but it also with a tinge, with a nuance of disagreement, that this is a thing we're against, a disapproval. Okay, so but the main content of the word is soglashenia. It's and that is a perfectly ordinary Russian word that means agreement. You look up in the dictionary, it means there's nothing controversial or anything about it. That's just what it means. If you're interested in the etymology of that, it comes from the same root as glasnost, because golos is voice, and so soglashenia, agreement, means that people are talking together. I mean, they're saying the same thing. So it's thoroughly like uncontroversial that I would call this agreementism. But why has no one done it before me that I know of? And it sounds pretty odd in English, so previous translators don't want to get into this and make it sound odd and all that. They want to make a readable book, so they've chosen two words basically to translate it, and this includes official translations of Lenin and Stalin and other sources from the period, as well as practically all secondary sources. Compromise and conciliatory, or conciliation. And okay, so these are related concepts, maybe, but they're not the same thing. It's just not, they don't, compromise does not, it means something else. And so does conciliation. You know, like a compromise is, what's the idea of a compromise? Is I give up something, you give up something, you know, and we make mutual concessions. Well, soglashenia, the agreement, does not imply that. It implies that we have an agreement. We both agree that this is a good thing to do, and we're going to work together to carry it out. So it's stronger than compromise. And there's another problem with compromise. There's a perfectly good Russian word for compromise, kompromis. And Lenin will sometimes, and the Bolsheviks weren't against compromise. They were against agreementism, but they were not against compromise. So Lenin at one point said, I'll offer you other Mensheviks and SRs, I'll offer you a compromise. You give up agreementism, and we will not try for a takeover in the near future, for an armed takeover. That was in September he did this. Okay, so what, if you'd follow the usual translation, he says, here's the compromise, you give up compromise. You know, it doesn't make sense. So compromise is one thing, and agreementism is another. Okay. And you know, and also when you read translations, the ism part, the fact that this is a sort of a doctrine or a tactic, a procedure, is being lost. There's no way of saying compromisism. One older book I read had compromise mongering. That's not bad, but it's a little clumsy. Okay, so and then there's one more problem, which I worried about. Is this inherently an abusive term? And so, you know, if you read a Soviet history books, they use it all the time, but they do it in a very partisan, you know, abusive way. But when I started reading these people, and the last couple of years, I've really sort of focused on trying to understand where they're coming from. I find that that's the word they use, not agreementism, but agreement. They talk about what they want as an agreement. So I figured, okay, it's making agreement, the political agreement with elite society as the central issue, is not inherently partisan. It's not inherently abusive. So okay, to sum up, there are three Russian words. Soglashatelstva means ism, agreementism. There's another word, soglashately, means agreementists, you know, a person who does this sort of thing, who agrees with it. I mean, who supports it, I should say. And then just plain old soglashenia, meaning agreement. Okay. So I think I'll be clarifying if I now say a few words about agreementism and the party system in 1917. The party system, the dynamics of the parties, and I'm talking here just about the socialist parties. And when I say socialist parties, I mean Soviet parties, parties in the Soviet system. The three basic ones, of course, were the Mensheviks, Bolsheviks, and the SRs. Okay, so the basic political fact, as I said earlier, and we'll say again about 1917, is that at the beginning there was you all know this, that there was a Menshevik SR majority in the beginning, and they defended the idea of agreementism. They defended that they said there is an agreement, it's workable, and this is the way we'll get our program thing. And even from the very beginning, the Bolsheviks were opposed to it. And by September, they reversed. The Bolsheviks had the anti-agreementists had a majority, and the agreementists were now a minority and fighting for survival. But okay, so however, it's inaccurate and will lead you to a wrong sense of the dynamics if we just say Bolsheviks were the agreementists and the Mensheviks and the SRs were the the Bolsheviks were the anti-agreementists and the Mensheviks and the SRs were the agreementists, because there were significant anti-agreementist minorities within those other two parties, within the Mensheviks and within the SRs. The left SRs, you heard of them, and the Martov people in the Menshevik party was one anti-agreementist faction. Okay, so that's and were the Bolsheviks split? Okay, no, they were not split on this issue. And people will remind me, okay, in March there was a small group of Bolshevik agreementists, but they left even before Lenin showed up, or well, hours before, but before. And for me, this sort of proves that there was Bolshevik consensus here was this group at the beginning, but they had no future. They saw they had no future in the party, and they left right away. Okay, so what happens to a party when it's split on what I consider the basic, and many people consider the basic issue of the year? If they're split on the basic issue, they can't stay united. And what happened? There's two ways of falling apart, or two ways of happening. One was the Mensheviks, and I call that they imploded. That is to say, they spent so much time, the two factions, fighting each other, that they ended up with paralysis and went from being the majority party, the ruling party almost of the country, to nothing, to a frighteningly small minority by the fall. Really, one of the great political collapses. And then or you can explode like the SRs, who right on the eve of October Revolution broke into two parties, the left SRs and well, we can call them the right SRs. They didn't call themselves that. Okay. So if you overlook the agreementist issue, you can really not quite see how the dynamics of the system is working. And in particular, you can say, oh, well, the Bolsheviks had their disagreements and disputes, and the Mensheviks had their disagreements and disputes, and it's all more or less the same. Now, in principle, different, because they were split on the basic issue of 1917, and the Bolsheviks were not. The way I sum this up, with a small exception of the people in March I mentioned earlier, is not all agreementists, not all anti-agreementists were Bolshevik, but all Bolsheviks were anti-agreementists. Okay, that means the other party had anti-agreementists, but they were minorities, and basically they served to make those parties dysfunctional. And the Bolsheviks, whatever other disputes they had, were not divided on this issue, and that was the fundamental issue. Okay, so that's kind of an introduction to the topic, and I hope you know what I'm talking about when I say agreementism at this point. Okay, now I'm going to go a little into the history of it. First, was this something that predated 1917? Was it an issue that had been sorted out beforehand by disputes or working out? And the answer is yes, but in a somewhat different form, but in a form that was very adaptable to 1917. In pre-1917, the rhetoric and the arguments went like this, because the Tsar was still there. The agreementists were the liberals, the Liberal Party, or the cadets, but I'll just call them the liberal. And the people that they were seeking an agreement with, according to the Bolsheviks anyway, was the Tsars and the system, the Tsarist system. So in 1917, of course, there's no Tsar, so the Agreementists are now the Socialists, so-called moderate, or the Mensheviks and SRs, and the agreement is with the liberals. So it's sort of, the whole issue has shifted to the left because there's no Tsar. So is this a fundamental difference, fundamental change that in the status of the issue of agreementism? Well, some people say yes, but clearly not. So why is there a continuity? Well, first of all, Tsarism was around in 1917, even without the Tsar, and it was around in the presence of the general staff and the bureaucracy all over the world, and the army, and the all this. But most importantly, it was present in terms of the Tsarist war and the Tsarist foreign policy and the Tsarist secret treaties and the Tsarist allies. And so the liberals were seeking agreement exactly with all those people. So that issue it's still rather continuous. Secondly, even in the old days, Bolsheviks were attaching this term to the other socialists. They were saying, you are not hostile enough to the liberals, therefore you are yourself an agreementist. And then finally, it's the basic critique of agreementism is the same and continuous. And the basic critique is, listen, you want to carry out a revolutionary change, radical change, however you want to define it, by making agreement with large forces in society, which is not a bad idea in itself, except that the interests, social class interests are so far apart that it won't work. That's the basic thing. It won't work. Won't get your change. And this sort of agreementism doesn't work in times of extreme polarization. When people when social forces are moving further and further apart, and so in a situation of polarization like this, accelerating polarization, some people say, let's all get together. Let's all the reasonable people get together, and we'll avoid isolation, and we'll avoid civil war, and we'll keep the allies, and we'll get things accomplished much more efficiently, much more without so much conflict and waste. And that's not a bad thing to want to do. That's the only trouble is says the anti-agreementist critique, that it won't work. You are evading a choice that you're going to have to make anyway. It's an either-or choice coming up. You're going to have to choose. You can't evade it. And in an attempt to evade it, you're indulging in wishful thinking. And that, I think, is, for me as well as the Bolsheviks, where I really agree with them, is that the agreementists in 1917, that was their curse, wishful thinking. And let me, there's a phenomenon that needs to be explained. Is, let's take the figure of Kerensky, who is the head of the government, as you know, and Alexander Kerensky. So he was totally popular. He was the most popular guy in Russia in March, April, May, and then by September, a few months later, everybody hated him. Everybody wanted him out of there. But the only reason they didn't do it is because they were afraid what might come next. So what happened to this rise and fall? Sudden rise, sudden fall. And the same thing with the Mensheviks. They were like the governing party. They had the majority in the Soviet. I mean, the SRs were following the Menshevik lead, and they determined government policy, basic government policy. Well, I think in both the same answer explains both their rise and fall and Kerensky's rise and fall. It was, the popularity was based on wishful thinking from both camps. The Soviet camp said Kerensky is going to guarantee that elite society is going to be on our side. And elite society looked at Kerensky and said, here's a guarantee that the Soviets are going to be on our side. Each side was and the same with the Mensheviks. Each side saw them as, yes, we'll work together and we'll work out a program, except they had very different ideas of what that program was. So, and as soon as both sides were disillusioned, in the strict sense of the word, they lost their illusion about this. And so by September, both these forces were, nobody wanted them, because they, the elite societies, the currency is not going to get the Soviets to cooperate, and the Soviet constituency said Kerensky is not going to stop people like Kornilov from trying to, hang us all. So the only reason that they stayed in power was inertia and a fear of, if I get rid of Kerensky, who's going to take his place? Okay, so wishful thinking and the logic of 1917. Okay, I'm going now to try to explain something which I've only recently become aware of myself. I'm going to try to explain it. I hope it makes sense. And it's a little complicated, so bear with me. And I'm going to try to talk about this situation in March 1917, before Lenin showed up, because the basic fault lines, the basic strategies, the basic forces were on the move at that time, and the agreementism issue was the center of it already. And it's much more clear to realize that that Lenin did not change or introduce this fundamental issue, but understood it and rode with it. Okay, so full disclosure, I think most of you know I have my own views on what happened in March. I'm opposed to a standard view on both the activists and the academics, as I call them, and that Stalin and Kamenev and the other March Bolsheviks were practically Menshevik agreementists themselves, and that the party needed severe rearming. So listen, I know that some people are going to object to this, and probably we'll hear from them later, but I'm just giving you full disclosure. This is controversial, and I just don't want to bother giving my proof for it. I'm going to assume it and talk about what I think when we get rid of the false story of the rearming, what story do we have left? And I'm especially want to look at, my main evidence, I won't go into it here, but my main evidence for this is a much overlooked Soviet conference, all Russian Soviet conference that took place at the end of March. And for various reasons, this has been sort of not erased exactly, but pretty much overlooked. Okay, so now I'm going to try to explain to you in a fair amount of detail what the agreementists themselves are saying. This is, as I said, fairly new research. I've been reading these people, and the main person whose name you should really keep in mind is, his name is Irakli. That's the first name. Tsereteli. It's a Georgian name. He, like Stalin, was from Georgia, and where Georgia was one of the main, the Soviet, well, it wasn't Soviet yet, not the southern U.S. state, but the one down in the Caucasus, and it was a home bed of Menshevism, actually, and so Tsereteli, it really was one of the most important people of 1917, and he's been forgotten along with the same sorts of reasons that agreementism has been forgotten. Okay, so this is based on what he said and what the other Menshevik and SR agreementists were saying in March. Okay, first there was something, the agreement. There was an agreement. That was one of the things that struck me when I read this. And what was the agreement? It was something that came up in the very first hours of the revolution, the February Revolution, before the Tsar abdicated. It was an agreement between the newly formed Soviet, which had only been formed hours before, beforehand, and the newly formed provisional government. And the agreement, I'm going to give out what the agreement is, but it was the provisional government came to be because of this agreement, because they needed the Soviet to endorse them. Okay, here is what the agreement was, and as told by the agreementists themselves. First of all, the provisional government is a representative of the elite society, but we can work with them. That's the basic proposition. The provisional government is the vlast. It is the vlast, meaning the sovereign power, the government. We don't deny you are the vlast, and so they say they're denying that there was essentially a double power or dual power or double vlast or anything. They deny that. They say no, not us. You are the vlast, but you, the government, agree to carry out revolutionary reforms, protect against the counter-revolution, which is defined as monarchist forces, and to strive to get a swift and democratic peace, end to the war, by revising war aims and so forth. Okay, so that's what you agree to carry out that revolutionary program, and we, the Soviet forces, agree to give you our approval and endorse you, and we'll work with you on defense efforts, and we will not threaten you with overthrowing you or anything like that. We'll work together to achieve this revolutionary program. And the idea was that again, it's not a compromise, because the idea was that there were enough people in elite society who were progressive enough, the vital forces, the progressive bourgeoisie, other terms people used, that saw the necessity of these radical revolutionary changes and the need for peace. And so they were definitely committed to this agreement, almost the Constitution, almost of achieving revolutionary reforms. Okay, now the complication and what needs to be is that there was something else going on, and this is something I've been reading. I saw when I was reading the material, especially of the Soviet conference, that there was something I call the unwritten constitution. This is more basic than the agreement. This is more basic about what the agreementist leaders themselves were telling the Soviet constituency about how revolutionary Russia worked. And Tsereteli, I think, this is where its importance comes in, because he really came up with this and pushed it. And so at the same time as they're telling the provisional government, don't worry, you are the vlast, you are the sovereign power, we're not going to interfere, they were also telling the Soviet constituency and the Soviet system, you are the de facto vlast. You really have the power. You are the power in the land. And so you can get your revolutionary program through. I don't know why well, anyway, that's what they were telling them. They said it many times. Ultimately, the workers and the soldiers, are in control, and you don't have to insist on it, but your program is going to go through. And so why was it? First of all, the workers and the soldiers carried out the revolution. And there's a lot of truth to that. The revolution became a revolution with the soldiers' revolt, and the workers were sort of leading the whole forces. So the workers and the soldiers did carry out the revolution. Well, and secondly, you put the provisional government into existence. With your agreement, with your seal of approval, you put the provisional government into existence. So it's a sort of a constitutional, ultimate right. You have the right to impose your program on this, on the government. You have the right to set the program. You have the right actually to say who gets to be minister and who gets not to be minister. We have let these cadet liberal party people be the ministers, but it's our choice for our reasons. And Kerensky was a Soviet leader, was a leader of the Soviet, was a vaguely SR person. So he and he was in the government. So we have the right to say the program and the personnel of the agreement, which is like, pretty sovereign. And then you, the Soviet constituency, have the right to expect to see results. You have the right to expect to see results. And if you don't, this is the crucial implication. If you don't see these results, you have a right to install another government that will do it better. And so they're sort of endorsing the fact that you can replace or overthrow a government if it doesn't revolutionary enough, if it doesn't carry out the program. And they made this very explicit. That's a little shock to me, but it's very true. So and so there was a formula. I'll explain the logic of this. There's a formula that anyone who reads about the revolution knows about. It goes postolku poskolku, that's the Russian, and it's translated mainly, well, correctly enough, as insofar as. So and that formula said, we support the provisional government insofar as it carries out reforms. Well, and very soon that became associated with the Agreementists. In any history book, you'll see that formula as the classic formula for Agreementism, but that doesn't really doesn't explain the logic of it. It doesn't. It's actually a very subversive formula. We will support you insofar as you carry out reforms. And that's why the ministers, the ministers of the provisional government, not Tsar, sorry, the minister of the provisional government hated it. So there was some memoir, in other words, where a delegation starts from the army detachment, starts reading out, and we support the government insofar as, and the minister who was there just got up and walked out, because, what do you mean you're going to support us only insofar as we do this or that? We're the government. We're the velocity. You may disagree with us, but you support us as anyway. So but this is actually the unwritten constitution is we'll support you insofar as. So why the agreement has said that, but they didn't mean it. The Bolsheviks, maybe you could say the Bolsheviks or the anti-agreementists were the only ones who took it seriously. They said, okay, once we showed you, once we convince you that the provisional government is not revolutionary, well, then we'll replace it. We won't support it anymore. And support in this context means replace. To not support means to replace, to overthrow. And whereas with the agreementists like Tsereteli, they were not being fully sincere with themselves, and at the end of the year, people realized that even though the provisional government was getting more and more feeble and more looking more and more counter-revolutionary, even to many people, perhaps not fairly, they were not ready to support it. They said insofar as, but they didn't mean it, because they really did not want to break with elite society and become isolated. Okay, so what did the Bolsheviks say? The Bolsheviks, and again, I sort of stress that this is based on what the Bolsheviks were saying in March, before Lenin came. Except no substitutes. If you hear different, it's incorrect. Okay, first of all, they accepted the unwritten constitution. That's why not? They accepted what the Tsereteli and those other people were saying. I'm going to quickly read them. You are the de facto vlast. You carried out the revolution. You, the workers and soldiers, put it into existence. You have the right to impose your program. You have the right to expect results, and you have the right to replace it if you don't see the results. Well, what's not to like, So, but then they said, okay, they said, yes, we agree with the unwritten constitution, but we disagree with the agreement, with the strategy that you're using to impose your will. It's just not viable. It's just not going to work. And throughout the year, this is what happened, that the Bolsheviks and the anti-agreements minorities and the other parties stressed that that the agreement was failing to work, and by the end of the year, it was like a joke, you know, like that you could ever expect to accomplish things through coalition or through any kind of agreement. So the critique got, I think, as you watch it, became more and more profound during the year. In the beginning, it was, you won't get the revolutionary program, the old revolutionary program of land of the peasants and democratic republic. You won't be able to carry out that revolutionary program with with elite society, because they're thoroughly committed to the war. They're thoroughly committed to the Allies, the Anglo-French capital, as it was always called, and they just won't do it. They can't do it. They can't do it. And will not. Then the more profound critique: the agreement will not be able to solve the war-induced crisis. You know, Russia was accelerating into a crisis, economic and social and every other way, all during 17. And then finally, it got to say, you know, the agreement is not even providing basically effective government, basically effective services, nothing. It's collapsing. It's paralyzed. It's not basic defense is not being taken care of. So in March, the Bolsheviks were saying, listen, we can't overthrow the Soviet right now. There's a Soviet majority for it, so that's fine. We agree we can't overthrow it, but we think it's thoroughly counter-revolutionary, the provisional government. We think it'll quickly show its real class nature. I think it'll quickly become evident to everybody that they can't carry out the class program, they can't carry out the revolutionary program. And when we get that majority in the Soviets, then we'll overthrow it. And you know, that's more or less what happened. So the Bolsheviks, even from the get-go, were saying, life is working for us. The revolutionary forces, the logic of the deepening revolution is for us. Okay, I'm getting a little late here, so I'm going to. Okay, so what do I say here? I'm going to sort of speed it up here. Okay, so is there another basic issue? Is there another issue that's more basic or equally basic, a dividing line? Okay. Well, let me mention one that was used in 1917 before I get to the main one that I want to talk about. And that's defensists versus internationalists. Okay, so defensists versus internationalists was the way they talked about it then in many ways. So since I like to go with the people's own vocabulary, I approve of it, but there are various reasons why that's one-sided. It focuses only on the war issue. In some ways, the Bolsheviks were defensists. In some ways, the Mensheviks were internationalists. But in real life, the defensists were agreementists, and the internationalists were anti-agreementists. So that's just a matter of vocabulary, really. I think the agreementist was more basic then, and I think we should think of it as basic. Okay, the other candidate for the basic issue is, perhaps you've been thinking about this, is this a bourgeois democratic revolution or is this a socialist revolution? And there's that theory that's the basic issue goes back, way back. The Mensheviks and the SRs and many bourgeois liberal type spokesmen said that in 1917 as a way of saying it's a bourgeois democratic revolution, therefore you can't even think of Soviet power. And for unfortunate reasons, Trotsky picked this up. In 1970, he said something very different, but he picked it up later in 1924. The Stalinists picked it up for their reasons. The academics picked it up for their reasons. So there's sort of a consensus that the real issue was socialist revolution, and that fits in with Lenin comes back. He says a new thought that going to be this is a socialist revolution going on, and therefore we have Soviet power. Well, there's two problems with that that framework by making that the central issue. Number one, it's not logical. That is to say, the basic proposition is of that way of thinking is that unless you say it's a socialist revolution, there's no excuse, there's no rationale for Soviet power, for Sovietskaya vlast. That's just not true. And both Lenin and Trotsky went out of their way to make that exact point in 1917. There's lots of reasons why you need Soviet power, even if it's a bourgeois democratic revolution. You want to carry out the revolution. In fact, the Bolsheviks had been saying that for a long time. Yes, it's a bourgeois democratic revolution, but you need the workers and the peasants to carry it through to the end. And Karl Kautsky had, back in the day, had said the same thing. So this is not a particularly new or even un-Marxist view, unless you want to call Kautsky un-Marxist. Okay, so that's one part. It's not logical. The other one is that just wasn't the issue that people argued about. I've tried to show this elsewhere, but it's just if you look at the writings of the Bolsheviks and their speeches and their papers and everything, they just did not make this part of their central part of their message. There was a world socialist revolution going on, and Russia was part of it, but they did not claim that there was a socialist revolution in Russia. They may have thought it. I can't read their thoughts, but they didn't say it, and they had good reasons not to say it. Okay, so if we look at the Bolshevik message was throughout the year: agreementism doesn't work. You have to reject it. You have to have Soviet power. Okay, so I'm going to after talking for about 45 minutes here, I'm now getting into the rise and fall of agreementism, and it's in 3 chapters. Chapter 1 is like I've explained March. In March, the agreementists have a strong majority, and why not? Why not? If you can get the reforms that you want, the radical changes that you want, in agreement with elite society, why not do it? It's a good idea. You get, it's just much less messy, much more efficient, much less waste and tragedy. We don't open the front to the Germans, so it makes sense. The only thing is that it's not going to work. That's all. So chapter 1 is sort of from say March or to the end of August. Chapter 1 is a succession of crises. There's a phrase that was always being used: "Krisis vlasti," the crisis of the vlast, or the crisis of government, political crises. And there's one after the other. There's famous one in April, one in June, there's one in July, there's one in August. For some reason, May 1917 does not seem to have its own particular crisis, but there was all going on all the time. And each time, sort of the agreementist would look like it wasn't working, and there was a shuffle, and they sort of dug down deeper with more agreementism, but the anti-agreementist sentiment in the Soviet constituency grew. Okay, that's chapter 1, progressive disillusionment by the Soviet constituency about agreementism. Chapter 2 is what I call zombie agreementism. And this comes after the Kornilov attempted coup d'etat. And the immediate consequence of that is that the Bolsheviks get de facto majorities in the capital city Soviets, Petrograd and Moscow. And so why do I call it zombie agreementism? Because there's no more agreement anymore. There's just not, neither side is interested in the agreement anymore. So the agreementists, leaders, and here Tsereteli is very prominent among them at this point, are sort of trying to prove the viability of agreement that neither party is really interested in. That's why I call it zombie. It's working on inertia, and I won't go into details. It's kind of a fascinating thing, but basically, it's just a matter of time before the Soviet constituency votes in a new leadership. It's only a matter of time before a provisional government tries to do something about the Soviets. Okay, as you would know, what happens if they just sort of are knocked over. I think I extend that chapter to the Constituent Assembly. Constituent Assembly is sort of an attempt, last-ditch attempt of agreementism, because the idea of the Constituent Assembly is
here is a legitimate institution. Everybody agrees with it. Everybody can follow it. Because it's been elected by everybody, it will have legitimacy. But the trouble is that the Bolsheviks walked out. Even before they shut it down, they walked out. And that was the important thing. And the elite society was not interested in the Constituent Assembly either. So it didn't exist. So chapter 3 is after October in the Civil War. And here, I think we explain what was going on with the Menshevik and the SR during the Civil War. And there's two ways that agreementism, it was total failure. And there are two ways politically, two ways that happened. One's the Menshevik way, which is sort of paralysis. You didn't want to help the Bolsheviks because they were, demagogues and barbarians and brutal, but you didn't want to. You're not going to join up with the counter-revolution to put down the Bolsheviks, but the counter-revolutionaries are the only force that have a chance of overthrowing the Bolsheviks. So neither choice is palatable. You can be very eloquent and insightful about how bad each choice is, but you yourself are paralyzed because what are you going to do? And the other way is the SR way, the right SRs, and they went out and tried to form a government out in the Volga region in 1918. And it will also completely fail, again, for the same reasons. The workers weren't interested in it. They tried to say, here, the workers, peasants, and middle class, we're all going to work together in this. It was based in Samara, and it just fell apart and was overthrown essentially by military dictatorship headed by Admiral Kolchak. So. And the basic reason is if you're going to overthrow the Bolsheviks, you have to work with the army, and the army is not going to. Why should the army bother with you? You're not bringing anything into the the agreementists. So agreementism then. There's good reasons for why it was so popular at the beginning of the year. Good reasons why it collapsed, and sort of what happened finally is that it became irrelevant. And the real issue was either the revolution or the counter-revolution. Those were the two forces that were battling it out, and the fate of Russia depended on who won that war, and the agreementists just had to sit on the side. And that concludes my talk. Thank you.